Hello painters, Ben from Ashenhold Art here, and in this video I'm going to walk you through how I painted Miss Marvel in both her normal and in Big forms for my personal collection. So you will hopefully see from the turntable shots here that I went for a slightly trippier, more exotic colour palette than the usual red and blue that you may be used to seeing the character in. I was somewhat inspired to do this after watching the Disney Plus show. I feel that it encapsulates the personality of the character a bit better, while at the same time a more exotic colour palette lends itself to underpinning her more exotic roots, being of Pakistani origin. So I start things off with painting the skin, and for that I used a roughly 50-50 mix of Scale 75's Kalahari Orange and Arabic Shadow, and that is applied all over the areas where the skin nice and even, working quickly and as opaque as possible. The Kalahari Orange and Arabic Shadow mix is completed. I'm then going to add a very small amount of Scale 75 Violet to that mix, and I'm going to start putting in a little bit of shadow onto the skin. This is going to help to give it a little bit of depth, and you're only using a very small amount of violet on the mix here, because if you use too much, the transition is going to be a bit too stark. And the mix here is more or less at a glaze consistency, and then what I'm doing is I'm using a push stroke to push the stronger part of that mix into those shadows. So for instance, when I'm doing the cheekbones, the core of the shadow will be right under the cheekbone, just as you see there, and then the shadow tapers off slightly towards the jaw. And you should have something that looks a bit like this. It reads a lot better on the bigger model. If I'd planned this a little bit better, I probably would have done more of the painting on the larger model. If things are looking a bit too stark, if your shadows are a bit too strong, you can always go back to your mix of Arabic Shadow and Kalahari Orange and do a little bit of touching up to ease some of those transitions and blends. Then I'm going to go back to the pure mix of Kalahari Orange and Arabic Shadow, and I'm going to start to add in a little bit of Ice Yellow, and you can just add a small amount just now, just to lighten that colour a bit more. And what we're going to start doing here is highlighting up and very, very gradually adding a little bit more Ice Yellow to that mix in subsequent applications. You want to be careful here that you're not going over too much of our base coat, because that base coat is our source colour. That's the colour that the skin would be, obviously without any light or shadow hitting it. So the best way that you can do for applying your highlights is to make sure you have a good strong light source underneath you, and if you pay attention to the way that the light is falling on those areas of skin, that's really going to help you to create a highlight that will emphasise the details quite nicely. And eventually you can probably go all the way up to an almost pure Ice Yellow in some of the strongest highlights, and you should be able to see here again on the larger model. So if you use too much of the highlight and too much of the shadow when you're painting, you can always go back in and glaze some of that source colour in again, which is what I've done there. And by the end of that process, you should have something that's looking like this. And that is pretty much our skin tone done. So obviously Miss Marvel is wearing the sort of classic superhero masquerade style mask here. So what I did here was, rather than having the skin painted in around the eyes, was I took a little leaf out of Hollywood's book. And if you've ever watched Christian Bale when he's getting ready to be put into his costume for when he's doing the Batman films, what they do is they actually have like a very dark black painted around his eyes, and then the cowl goes over him, so it means that his eyes really pop when he's in costume. So similarly, what I've done is I've left the black around the inside of the mask, and then I just do a little bit of abyssal blue and anthracite grey highlight around that, just to give it a bit of definition. And the eyes themselves painted in using, and then the pupils are painted in using Games Workshop's Citadel colour range Rhinox hide. And it's always better when you're painting pupils in, rather than try to paint the ball of the pupil or the iris, is to sketch in lines either end and then fill in those lines that you've drawn. It helps with the placement of the irises, and it just means you're going to have a bit of a neater job. And then finishing touch for the eyes is a little dot of white. So the source colour, the colour that I'm going to use as the base coat for the burkini, the main torso section of it, is Sotek green. And again, we're base coating here, so we're looking for a nice thin and opaque consistency with our paint, and we cover the whole of this section of the model, working with very quick and decisive strokes, and we want to use as few applications as possible here in order to avoid any unwanted texture. Our other areas that we painted in the Sotek green would also be the boots and the mask and the scarf and the leggings and the arms. They'll be painted in a red colour. So the reason that I opted for Sotek green over a more traditional primary blue that you would get from Miss Marvel is, after watching the Disney Plus TV show, I decided that I wanted to inject a little bit of a more exotic flavour to the miniature. So I felt that using brighter and more vibrant sort of secondary colours, it felt a bit more appropriate for the character's Pakistani roots. So as you can see, I've been doing the shading here on the burkini. I used Scale 75's deep blue to do the shading. And for my highlight colour, I went back to Sotek green and I mixed in a little bit of Caribbean blue from the Scale 75 range, with the sort of, to create that sort of spandex look or feel to, you know, that tends to be the material that the superhero costumes are made from. I like to use a lot of diffused lines with the highlight, and then what I'll do is I'll go back with the source colour and just blend a little bit of them in, just so that it doesn't look too stark, and it creates that impression of the sort of tighter, more elasticated material being stretched over the contours of the wearer's body. So you want a little bit of texture there to create that impression of the material being strained and stretched, but you don't want too much texture that it looks like it's weathered. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. So for the red elements, I used a mix of Pro Acryl's Bold Pyro Red mixed with Vallejo Game Colours Warlord Pink. So the Pro Acryl Pyro Red is a very, very saturated and vibrant red. It's a really loud, strong colour. and it can actually cause, next to the vibrance of that turquoise that we've used, it can actually cause a little bit of eye strain for the wearer. But also I didn't want it to be fully red, as I've mentioned before. I wanted my Miss Marvel to have a little bit more of an exotic colour palette. So I decided that I wanted something that was a little bit more of a magenta red than a primary red, which is why the Warlord, although it's described as Warlord Purple, it really is a slightly muted magenta colour. So I mixed those two together to get the base colour that you see for the red here. And again, as I've mentioned previously, you might find that you do want to go back and rework some of your highlights and shadows because it's quite strange how the human eye interprets colour, but colours can start to appear quite different depending on what colours are next to them. So you might find that once you've got that red in there, that you might particularly want to rework some of the blue. And there you can see here how it's looking. At this stage I also went in and laid down a base colour for the metallic elements, which would be the lightning bolt symbol on her torso and the bangle on her left arm. And those, the base colour I used for them was Rhinox hide, and it's just going to be a metallic over that. So it doesn't really matter as long as you're using a sort of red brown. And to shade the fuchsia or red elements, whatever you want to call them, I went back to some scale 75 violet, and there's nothing mixed in with this. And again, work it down roughly to a sort of glaze consistency, and you're paying attention to the way that light and shadow falls on the miniature, and you're looking for shadows on those red elements, and you're looking to accentuate them again, paying attention to where the core of the shadow, which by the core of the shadow we obviously mean where the shadow is at its most intense, because for instance here on the legs, the cores of the shadow will be, as you can see on this finished one, that stripe along the outside of the leg, because what happens is either side of that, it means you're going to see a little bit of reflected light, and it just looks a little bit more natural. So you can see here we've got a good idea of how she's going to look now. The colour scheme is looking pretty solid. It's coming together nicely. I think I probably would rework a little bit of the blue here. Add back in some of the highlights because the blue is starting to look a little bit weak there. But the next thing is we go back to that mix of the Pro Acryl Pyro Red and the Game Colour Warlord Purple, and you add a little bit of Ice Yellow from the Vallejo model colour range to that to give us some highlights. And again, paying attention to how light falls on our miniature, we're going to go back and we're going to place some highlights in there. And don't worry if these come out a little bit too stark. Again, what you want to do is start off small and work out the way, because it's much easier to do that than it is to try and cut away if you've put too much in. Metallics now. So once you've laid down a base coat of Rhinox hide, what you want to do is use a mix of Pro Acryl Bronze and Pro Acryl Rich Gold, because I find that Rich Gold can be quite a rory colour. It can be a little bit too much on its own, and where I do like to use Pro Acryl Bronze on its own a lot, I thought it was a bit too muted for the vibrant colour palette of Miss Marvel, so I decided to mix the two of them. That was more or less a sort of 50-50 mix, and that'll give you quite a tasteful orangey gold colour. But you just apply that all over, leaving the barest amount of the Rhinox hide showing through just to give us a little bit of an outline. And then you should have something that looks like this. So for the hair, I used a tried and tested method for painting black, and that is based around Scale 75's Abyssal Blue, which is used as the source colour, and I would use Vallejo Model Colours Black as a shadow colour. And then once you've blocked in some of the Abyssal Blue, I go back in with some anthracite grey to pick out some more highlights. A good tip for painting hair is to try and avoid painting individual strands, because it just doesn't look right when you do. This maybe sounds a little bit strange, but what I found quite helpful when I was really starting to try and improve how the hair on my models looked was to think about hair in a similar way to how you would paint non-metallic metals. Just the contrast is not quite as stark as it would be in non-metallic metals, because hair does have quite a sheen and a shine to it. It's not as reflective as metal, but if you try that out, you might find that helpful. For shading the rich gold and bronze mix, I took a little bit of the Warcolours range and mixed in some black gold and Choco. The Warcolours range of metals are just excellent for blending, because they don't tend to misbehave as much with the water, and they're not quite as powerful as the likes of the Pro Acryl. So again, that was just applied to any areas where shadows are falling, and you can ease those transitions with a little bit of an orange or a sepia tone contrast paint. But just be careful, because the contrast paints have a tendency to matte down whatever surface you apply them to. And for highlighting on the rich gold bronze mix, I added a bit of Pro Acryl white gold. It would highlight all the metallic areas with just pure white gold in those areas where the highlight would be most intense. Again, paying attention to how the light behaves across that lightning bolt, and that's generally a little bit easier to observe on glossy surfaces like those metallics. And there you have it, folks. That is how I painted Miss Marvel in both her normal and her embiggen forms. I hope you enjoyed that video and that you found it instructive, and that it can be an inspiration of you in your own hobby journey, whether you are painting Miss Marvel yourself or whether there's some techniques here that you are going to adapt into something else you're working on. I'd love to know what it is you're working on, so please let me know in the comments below whether you're painting a Miss Marvel on your own, or whether you, like we said, are going to use these on another project, because like any of these techniques, as much as I am showing you in most of these videos how to paint or to do a technique on a specific model, they can almost always be used elsewhere with a little bit of skill and reapplication. But if you could also let me know if there's anything in particular you'd like to see me cover on this channel, whether it's a specific model or specific technique, I'd love to hear from you guys, and I'd love to be able to help build something that's going to be helpful for everyone. So thank you very much for tuning in, if you stayed this long especially, and I'll see you in the next one.